The LandCruiser 70 series keeps soldiering on in Australia, and we've got a 70th anniversary model here today. This is the 79 series single cab. This is kind of the really iconic four-wheel drive in Toyota's history, and it hasn't changed much over the years. This 70th anniversary model does have a few updates and changes. It's a limited edition model, and a lot of Australians will be very lucky to get their hands on one of these. It's hard to believe, but this vehicle actually has a 2.5 year waiting list in Australia at the moment. It's actually one of the most sought after vehicles on sale, even though it has some of the least features on sale as well. This model, it does get a bit of a blacked out exterior look here. You'll notice that there has some black wheels there. The headlights are a little bit different, and it's got a black bumper on the front and guards. And on the inside, would you believe it, they've actually put some cup holders in this thing along with some USB points. You wouldn't even read about it. But this thing is all about traditional four-wheel driving at the end of the day. It's one of the few live axle four-wheel drives left on sale in Australia. It's still manual only, and it's got a V8 turbo diesel, which Australians do love. But the question is, does this ute still make sense in Australia? It is a bit of a dinosaur, and yes, people love it, but is it actually any good? Well, we want to find out today. We're going to take it for a drive. We're going to do some forward driving in the bush to see if it is actually capable at all off-road, and we'll also dig through the interior and see how comfortable this thing is for the day-to-day usage. Very few cars can claim 70 years of history in Australia, and this is one of them, the Toyota LandCruiser. Toyota has rolled out a special edition version of the venerable and antiquated 70 series LandCruiser. That is in 79 series single cab and dual cab variants, along with the 76 series station wagon. The troop carrier, also known as the 78 series, misses out on the special treatment. This celebration model starts as a GXL and adds on a range of cosmetic enhancements: black wheels, blacked out heritage style grille, smoky headlights, black flares, LED fog lights, LED daytime running lights, and of course a bit of 70th anniversary badging. Otherwise, this is the same old story. A four-wheel drive design that is as old as time itself, and this is easily the least modern new car that you can currently buy in Australia today. The 4.5 litre turbo diesel V8 does sound great, but numbers don't look that impressive on paper. There's 151 kilowatts available and 430 newton meters. That torque is lazy and wide-ranging, however, and it's available from near idle all the way up to 3,200 RPM, and peak power doesn't come on too far behind that. That is a very low 3,400 RPM. This all runs through a low-geared 5-speed manual gearbox. There is no automatic transmission available here. There is also a low-range transfer case, which is also nice and low, part-time four-wheel drive, auto-locking hubs, and like a GXL, this gets locking differentials front and rear. The 79 series LandCruiser has a 3.5 tonne braked towing capacity and a payload of around 1,200 kilos. That is a cab chassis, however. So add on the steel Toyota tray like we have here, and expect that number to drop to somewhere just below 1 tonne. The other element that has changed here, of course, is the price. Compared to a normal 79 series single cab GXL, you're looking at a $7,000 premium for this 70th anniversary model. Now that might seem a bit steep, but don't forget that there is a big waiting list for this car, up to 2.5 years. And regardless of the price hike, these limited edition models are already likely to be snapped up. Here is the interior of the 70 series, and this is where a lot of the changes are for this car, and mostly, in my opinion, it is for the better. Like I mentioned before, we've actually got some cup holders and a little bit of storage in this thing. Other 70 series LandCruisers just didn't have it. I think that Toyota might have been looking at what the aftermarket has been doing for the 70 series for quite a few years now, and they've added something of a center console here. You've got a cup holder, there's 2 USB power outlets there, and a bit of storage here, a couple of extra cup holders, so we're up to 3 already. That's not too bad, better than the 0 that it had before. And then there's more storage and a couple of extra USB power outlets here as well. Now, being a 70th anniversary model, they've kind of tarted up the LandCruiser a little bit with a bit of pretend wood grain here. It goes across the front of the glove box there and across the center console. You've got the same old-fashioned air conditioning controls that they have used these for I don't even know how long. It's been many, many years. They're mechanical, and they're getting to the point where they're almost cool, I think, in a way, potentially. I mean, spending so much money on a brand new car and getting this sort of thing will offend a lot of people, but I kind of like that Toyota is sticking to its mechanical guns. It kind of goes against this whole nature of the wood grain though, because this is a ute that's about its working credentials, its utility, and just being a hard-working tool. And I kind of think that this whole treatment that Toyota has done, yes, it's a celebration of this car, but it kind of goes against the grain of its history as well. You've got some nice gaiters here on the gear shifter there. You've got that one there for there, and the stubby lever as well, and the handbrake. But I feel like they kind of started giving up by the time they got to the handbrake, because this is a weird fitment, I would say, over the handbrake. And if you peel it back a little bit, you can actually see the original one there as well. I've never seen that before in a car. It's just a little bit odd, I would say. But other changes here, we've got I would call it a faux leather seat, which is pretty comfortable. It's nice, it's all manual, and you've got a steering wheel. That looks to be stolen out of a Hilux or maybe even a LandCruiser Prado. There's a bit of that wood grain going on up here as well, and you've got two massive button blanks here, because in other models you would have things like your infotainment controls up on there, maybe a bit of cruise control and that sort of thing, but in this, that does not apply. You do have cruise control, that's down here next to the steering wheel, but the infotainment, which I will get to now, is not touched by this steering wheel. So yes, you do have a screen here, and it is a touch screen. However, you don't have Apple CarPlay in this infotainment display. You don't have Android Auto. There is navigation, however, but there is no digital radio. So this is definitely a step up from a normal single DIN system that you would get in a LandCruiser 70 series. But I think if anyone's pretty serious about this car, they're going to go after market, and they're going to spend the $600, $1,000, whatever it might be, on a system that actually has some features, because this is good, yes, but it's not much harder to do a bit better. This LandCruiser cannot hide its old bones, however. This is a car that is based on a design from the 1980s, and it goes back to, well, 70 years, right? That is how far back the 40 series, even the 20 series, goes back in Toyota's history, and there are some really old school things going on here. One of them is the exterior mirrors. It's just a bit of bracket that they've knocked up. It looks like something almost a little bit homemade. It's definitely heavy duty, but you cannot adjust these in any other way other than actually getting out of the car or undoing the window and trying to do it that way. You'll notice that there's a pretty cool differential lock operation sticker here on the door. I'm pretty sure that hasn't changed for many, many years. And something else which is actually really cool is this. Check out the owner's manual. That is fully vintage and very, very old, but I think it's actually kind of cool. They have updated it with all the new things going on in this new 70 series, but I actually kind of really like that. Driving this LandCruiser around is a bit of a blast from the past, and depending on what you like out of your cars, that's either going to be a big positive or it's going to be a massive negative. This thing, it kind of reminds me more of my own car, which is like a 30-year-old four-wheel drive, than anything else that is new, and probably shouldn't be surprising because it's got a lot more in common with that car than anything new as well. Live axles, ladder chassis. This is a big, heavy car, and it's got big, heavy steering, big, heavy tires, all that sort of thing. This is a car that doesn't drive similar to any other four-wheel drive ute really out there at the moment. There used to be things like the Nissan Patrol that would get around. That was a similar experience. The Land Rover Defender as well. That is now a very modern car and is nothing like this thing whatsoever. So this is quite unique. If you look at it objectively, it's well below the standard of other vehicles. Ergonomically, comfort-wise, refinement, noise insulation, it's just not as good as anything modern out there. But at the same time, it's kind of enjoyable. It's engaging. You're shifting through the gears quite often. It's got a very low set of gearing through this 5-speed manual gearbox. The engine is all about low down torque. It doesn't really feel like it wants to rev too hard, so you find yourself just cycling through the gears. I'm currently doing about 70 k's an hour top gear, and I'm sitting below 1400 RPM, and the thing's quite happy to do that. The low gearing will be really beneficial for those people who are going to load gear on the back or tow and do that sort of thing quite regularly, but otherwise, if you're going to be munching a lot of highway k's in this thing, you're going to be wishing it had a 6th gear, because this engine, it's a big 4.5 litre V8, doesn't have that much power or torque on paper though, and you find going up hills and that sort of thing, it's not really that good. You could use a 6th gear on the cruise, absolutely, but you do need to sort of drop it down a gear and let it work a little bit harder to get up. Being a 70th anniversary model doesn't really change any of the driving dynamics either. That's all stuff you've got here. Yeah, the steering wheel's a little bit nicer, so is the gear shifter. You've got somewhere to put your latte when you're driving around town, but otherwise, it's fairly run-of-the-mill LandCruiser. And personally, I'm happy that this car still exists. It services a need that is still out there, and it's in massive demand at the moment as well. This thing's got a 2.5-year waiting list, which is kind of crazy. And a lot of people want this car because of what it represents, how it looks and how it makes them feel. The truth of the matter is, a lot of these people would be probably a lot more comfortable and happy in something like a Hilux or a Ranger that has a lot more refinement and comfort and safety and technology built into it, but it just doesn't tug at the heartstrings like this car does. And I did mention before, this is a big 4.5 litre V8. On paper, it doesn't read that well. It's got less power and less torque than a lot of the competition out there, and you can kind of feel it. The torque is available really low in the rev range, and that is a nice thing to have. I think peak torque is something like 1200 RPM. It comes on tap, and it's there for practically the whole usable rev range. But it's not as torquey, it's not as punchy, and it's not as powerful as more modern four-wheel drive utes out there with turbo diesel powertrains. But what I do like about it is that feeling you get off idle. You barely need to give it any throttle whatsoever. And this engine just feels completely unperturbed by lugging along at low revs. It doesn't get cranky, it doesn't sort of seem to miss or do any funny business down in those low rev ranges. It's quite happy to do that lugging work. So is it the best ute for you? Well, it depends. You're either into it or you're not. And take one for a test drive and you'll soon find out whether this will be something that you emotionally want, or you're just going to see it as being very old and very overpriced for what it is. I think it's safe to say that on-road driving isn't really the strength of this LandCruiser, but maybe it can claw back some points in the off-road stuff. This car does, after all, have one of the biggest reputations and one of the most hardcore followings of enthusiasts in Australia. And it's got this rich heritage that it can draw upon as well. But is that actually going to help it in an off-road challenge? I don't want to make things easy for this car. It is raining and it is wet, and there's a bit of a hill climb behind me there, full of ruts and slippery rocks and all of that sort of thing. But I want to make a bit of a challenge, a bit of a unique challenge for this LandCruiser as well. So I've got something set up for it. Let's see if it can do it. One thing I really like about this LandCruiser off-road is the gearing and just the way that this car feels in low speed situations. It's got a low range transfer case, of course, and it's got nice reduction in it. First gear is quite low. I think the only other vehicle that has a lower ratio than this off-road would be the Jeep Wrangler and Gladiator. That goes up to about 77:1. I'm not sure what this is off the top of my head, but one thing that this has that the Wrangler doesn't have is a big diesel V8 that is so happy to sit just off idle. I'm doing about 500 RPM at the moment, cruising down a fairly steep hill, and this thing just doesn't mind at all. One thing you'll notice as well on this LandCruiser, in comparison to more regular four-wheel drive utes, is just general ground clearance. It might not have the same clearance around the front diff as an independent suspension four-wheel drive, but it does have better general clearance overall. This is a body-on-frame, ladder chassis, old school design, and the body just sits much higher off the ground than anything else. So things like sill clearance, it's really good, and that you find that's often the first place where you start to hit off-road, and this can take on things that a standard four-wheel drive ute like a Ranger or a Hilux couldn't do without something like rock sliders. So straight away you're at an advantage. But there's something else I want to show you that is the most important party trick of this LandCruiser off-road. Alright, so at the bottom of a hill climb here, this is a hill climb that I've done fairly regularly in the past. Haven't done it in a 70 series in quite a while, and I think it's going to do it, but I'm going to make this a bit more of an interesting challenge. This thing has front and rear locking diffs, so I'm going to turn those on. There we go. I've got the red lights on the dashboard there. They're both on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my feet off the pedals completely. I'm going to crawl up as slowly as possible with no throttle input whatsoever. I'm going to see if this thing can climb it. This LandCruiser does have an off-road traction control mode that operates, but this is one of the few utes that has front and rear locking diffs, and it's an old school way of going about it, but I think it's still really good. A lot of utes have really good capability these days because of traction control, but I'm going to see what these diff locks do. And with this big V8 sitting off idle, it's about 500 RPM, plenty of torque there, through the ruts. My feet are off the pedals completely at the moment. This is literally off idle, crawling up, low range first gear, and it's doing it. Nice and easy. It's a little bit damp at the moment. It's been raining. I haven't aired down the tires either, so traction, that's slipping slightly there. I'll just keep the steering wheel straight. Traction's not plentiful underfoot, but this thing is not slipping a wheel. Just using the steering wheel slightly just to guide it up in the right direction. That is doing it super easy. Now you'd be able to drive other four-wheel drive utes up there. Of course, I've driven a few up there myself, but in some of them you do have to carry more speed. You can't do it in this slow crawling nature that the LandCruiser does, and it's about the nature of this vehicle, right? It's old school, and diff locks are an old school solution to traction off-road. There's no driving modes on this, there's no toggles, there's no switches, there's no readouts, but diff locks they literally lock all four wheels into spinning at exactly the same speed. So you're going to be doing pretty well to slip wheels in a situation like this. And this is just crawling up, as happy as Larry at the moment. Might not be the most exciting thing to watch because I'm going so slow, but it's easy, and that's what I really like about this car. Behind me there is a courthouse that dates back to 1837, which makes it quite an old institution and almost as old as the design of this LandCruiser. But in all seriousness, this is also an institution in its own right, especially in the Australian automotive scene. This thing has a really die-hard following, and it is for good reason. This is a dying breed of a vehicle, and it doesn't really compete. Yes, it does compete with other vehicles naturally out there, but it also doesn't, because it offers something very different. Now, the thing to say there is, if you're not actually using this thing hardcore, you're not towing all the time, you're not loading it up for years on end, you're not going off-road all of the time, the truth of the matter is you'll be better off with something else that's more refined, safer, more efficient, and more comfortable. Something like a Ranger, a Hilux, any of those other dual cab utes out there will do something better for you if you're not using this really seriously. But at the same time, I do take my hat off to this car because it does provide a service that other vehicles cannot do. It is just a heavy duty implement, and it is a dying breed. So I'm thankful that it's still around. The bad news is, of course, if you do want one of these vehicles, you will have to join the queue, and it's a bloody long one. 2.5 years, in fact, you'll be waiting for something like this. Now, if you like this review, head over to Drive.com.au for the full written review and all the pricing and spec information on this LandCruiser 70 series. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit subscribe and hit like, and thank you for watching.